Everyone, welcome to another Book Review Wednesday, and today I'm going to be discussing Elizabeth I by Marguerite George. This is one of, I think, her more famous works. As you can see, it is very lengthy, so it took me a good chunk of time to finish this book. And for what it was worth, I thought it was alright. I didn't think it was that impressive or as engaging as some of her other works. Like, for example, I find historical figures like Cleopatra and Helen of Troy a lot more interesting, and I guess I just like that history more for some reason. Or at least I think those kinds of very ancient historical figures are a lot more intriguing. Because we don't really know a significant much about, or at least a significant chunk about them. But for what it was worth, I thought that there were a lot of good parts to this particular interpretation of Elizabeth I, and other parts that I felt were a little bit way too lengthy and could have been significantly chopped up. I thought that there were a lot of points towards this book that I think were just a little bit too padded out for my taste. But basically, this particular story of Elizabeth I follows her primarily within sort of the second half, I want to say, of her reign. In other words, really her old or age accomplishments. And in case you're not really aware of who Elizabeth I is, basically she was a queen of England who reigned from, I think, the 1500s to sort of the earlier 1600s, if I'm not mistaken. As to the exact dates, they have them written down in the book, but I always end up forgetting because I'm pretty horrible with dates. But that's roughly around the period. But it primarily focuses on her later period within her reign. So she's already significantly old. And she sort of ends up having a very sort of impactful political life, sort of within at least that later period, because the Spanish were sort of going after England during the time, and Elizabeth was sort of trying to fight against them, and that was largely due to the fact that the Spanish were Catholic, and Elizabeth I was a Protestant. And this was really a period when we sort of see the religious division among Catholicism and Protestants, because a lot of the Protestant beliefs don't clash with Catholicism, and hence we have all of these wars that end up happening as a result of that, unfortunately. And Elizabeth sort of took a very significant role in preserving England and not giving it over to the Spanish and not having it pushed back to Catholicism, which was sort of an issue that really did get started by Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, because he wanted to divorce his wife and marry Elizabeth's mom. But it really doesn't go into that because it's primarily focused on really where it sort of really needs to be, which is Elizabeth. Also, you see sort of the struggles that she has within her own sort of, I guess, following and circle. And you sort of see how there's people who sort of don't follow her orders and who sort of end up kind of betraying her trust and whatnot, and you sort of see those impacts. You also see the Irish. They're also kind of a big, I guess, kind of frenemy, so to speak. And the Irish culture is primarily Catholic as well, so obviously that tension is there too. because of that. And you sort of see Elizabeth trying to kind of handle all of these different political aspects that were really important to England during that portion of her reign. Uh, Now, I will say, as a ruler for Elizabeth, I thought that she's actually a lot more likable than a lot of these other rulers that I've seen interpreted. Because usually, a lot of the way in which these rulers, in particular around this period, are sort of interpreted is that they're very spoiled, they're very narcissistic, and they're kind of full of themselves in their religion. Like they think God is on their side and blah, 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 blah. And, it just feels very preachy. But with Elizabeth's character, I was so happy that there wasn't any of that. I was so glad that this character was not a spoiled, rotten, queen, and that she was actually a very humble queen in the sense that she sort of really cared about her people, and that ultimately that's kind of why she made the decision to really not get married. And I think that was largely due to the fact that a lot of marriages, at least back in those days, were very politically oriented and class oriented. So it sort of made sense for her, at least, to, I guess, go down this sort of route, just so that she could kind of, I guess, keep the power for herself, so to speak. But regardless, she still seems to have at least a certain amount of grace and at least humility to her character. Other points where she kind of has to be very firm, and does she have her stubborn moments? Yes, obviously that's there. But again, you don't feel like she feels along high, like that she is that she feels like she's kind of sort of chosen by God, etc., etc. You feel like that she's not the kind of character who kind of talks down to her people. She's really one sort of with them. Unfortunately, her character does have to end up making decisions, and sometimes those decisions are sometimes cruel. But I think a lot of that is primarily due to the time period. Because during the time period, if you messed up and you portrayed the queen, that was like a sort of death sentence, unfortunately. Like if you went against the queen and you rebelled against her or tried to, cause any harm to her, it was really sending yourself away to be on the axe. And unfortunately, she has to make those tough calls, and it was sort of a thing where it was very custom for someone to have that kind of significant level of authority to where that they could sort of cast people out if they wanted to. And again, I don't think that aspect was right, and I'm not in any way advocating, Elizabeth's actions on that, but at the same time, within the context of the time period, this was something that was very common for rulers to do. This wasn't just an exclusive thing that Elizabeth I was, somehow different from the others. I mean, this was really, I think a lot of it really does stem from the fact that, again, it was a really different time period, and the moral standards and the way in which we treat people was a lot different back then from the way that we view human beings now. And again, I obviously don't think it's right, but at the same time, I think you have to kind of look things through the historical context as well. So I think primarily in which the novel is constructed is good in having certain parts of the story being told through Elizabeth's perspective. There are points where her cousin Lettice, who she kind of has a little bit of, Elizabeth has sort of a little bit of a riff with, considering the fact that Letitia's family is kind of a little bit irresponsible, and you sort of see how they kind of sort of have their, at least they have their tension, and a lot of that is fueled by Letitia's son, which you will see plays a significant role, at least within parts of the story. And although, again, I think there are certain aspects that are pretty interesting that happen throughout the story, I felt like that a lot of it could have been significantly cut down. And they do have points where William Shakespeare is actually sort of part of the story, considering the fact that he was around during this period and he was kind of making plays and, sort of bringing out that artistic platform to England. Although I think his significance is very minimal, I think he's only there to just give kind of a sort of historical context. I almost thought too that there were certain relationships that I didn't think needed to really be there. And again, although the other characters are fairly developed, the primary focus here really is Elizabeth. You sort of really do get in her kind of mindset and how she thinks, more so than you do with the other characters. So I think that's also sort of really important to understand. Even though you get things through Letitia's perspective, it's pretty limited because most of it, at least, is overshadowed by Elizabeth. But I think that's really all I can say about this particular book. I mean, I would recommend it if you are a Elizabeth I fan, like you think she's a fantastic historical figure who made a significant impact among history, then yeah, I would say that this is definitely a book that's worth reading. I do think that she is a good ruler, at least one of the good rulers that came and went. Obviously, there are many other rulers that were also really good too, but she sort of gave off, I think, something different than a lot of other rulers did, and that sort of seems to last and is really presented, I think, well within this particular book. But again, I think a lot of it needed to be a little bit more stripped down. I felt like some aspects were a little bit too long-winded and they didn't really need to be touched upon so much. I think had they made the story a little bit more intensely focused, and I also would have liked to know a little bit more about her earlier years and as to how she sort of became a ruler. When you're starting already from the fact that she's like, what, in her 50s or something, I think literally when it starts, like the book, she's already 50, or in her 50s. I mean, that doesn't really give a huge amount of context onto the person's life, especially when you're titling it Elizabeth I. Why not talk about her from her childhood or to her time when she became ruler? Why skip over that period? Because that period is pretty significant, considering the circumstances that were involved there too, which I do find pretty fascinating as well. I think a little bit more so fascinating than her going up against Spain or, whoever else power was trying to control England or create tension with England during the time. But yeah, I think that's though really ultimately all I can say about this particular book though. If there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.